Welcome, my family. Before we jump in, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. I'd also love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop your answers and any suggestions in the comments, and I might give you a shout out at the end of my next video. Thanks for being here and for all your amazing support. The first time I saw Walter Grange, he was standing at the edge of our property like he'd been waiting for me. Arms loose at his sides, posture tall but easy. His eyes fixed on me in a way that made the air feel tighter. I had a laundry basket hooked against my hip, sunlight sharp in my eyes, the wind lifting the clean cotton sheets from the line. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just raised one long arm and pointed toward the tree line at the back of our lot. "Don't dig there," he called, his voice carrying over the field like it was a warning meant only for me. Then he turned and walked away. I didn't know then that those words would be the thing I'd remember most, more than the photographs, more than the knocks in the night. But that was months after we'd moved to Briarford, months after I thought I'd finally found a place we could settle, where the boys could grow up with space to run, and where Daniel and I could breathe again. We hadn't planned on leaving the city for good, not really. It had been one of those dreamy conversations you have late at night, when the noise outside your apartment is just too much, when you're tired of parking tickets and damp walls and the neighbors' arguments bleeding through plaster. Someday, we'd said, when the twins were older, when the timing felt right, when work slowed down. Last fall, everything tipped. The apartment above us flooded for the second time in 6 months, and the landlord brushed it off like a wet ceiling was just part of city living. Mold crept into the corners of the boys' room. Caleb started coughing in his sleep. Owen's nose wouldn't stop bleeding. Our neighbor downstairs screamed at her boyfriend at 2 a.m, throwing bottles that shattered against our floor. And one night, there was a shooting 3 blocks away while Daniel and I were eating takeout on the couch. "What if we just left?" I'd said between bites, half expecting him to roll his eyes and tell me I was being dramatic. But Daniel didn't brush it off. He set down his fork, studied me for a long moment, and said, "Maybe we should." 3 months later, the city was in our rearview mirror. We'd closed on a modest, white-sided farmhouse with a wraparound porch and creaky pine floors just outside Briarford, a little town with a population of 600 and change. The kind of place where folks wave as they drive by whether they know you or not. Our place sat on 5 acres of open land that rolled down into a fringe of hardwoods, the kind of land that breathes. No sirens, no traffic, just wind in the grass and the far-off rattle of cicadas. The town itself had a single diner, a gas station, and a feed store. 40 minutes in any direction to find anything that looked like a city. I told myself that's what made it safe, that nothing bad could happen here without everyone knowing. For the first few weeks, it was exactly what I wanted. The boys played outside until dusk, coming in with burrs in their socks and dirt on their cheeks. I spent mornings in the garden, learning the stubborn clay soil and the way the sun moved across our yard. We painted the living room a soft green, hung our wedding photos by the stairs, and watched the house start to feel like it was ours. That's when I met Walter. It was a crisp March morning, frost lifting off the grass, when I spotted him across the narrow gravel road from our place. He was kneeling in his yard, trimming the edges of his flower beds with a pair of hand shears. When he saw me, he stood, tall, wiry, with thick silver hair slicked back, and a face that seemed 20 years younger than his posture suggested. "Morning," he called. "Good morning," I said, waving. "You must be the new folks in the old Miller place." "That's us," I smiled. "I'm Emily." "Walter," he said, striding across the road like he'd already decided to close the distance. "Been here all my life. Most folks around here are family, more or less. My daughter's down that way," he pointed to the left, "and my nephew's right next to you." His handshake was firm, his eyes a piercing blue, sharp and unblinking. I tried to guess his age, late 50s, early 60s. Later, Daniel told me Walter was 82. That was the first thing that didn't sit right. Walter's friendliness wasn't warm. It felt supervisory, like he was checking up on something he already owned. A few days later, he came by again, this time while I was weeding near the barn. "Just so you know," he said like he was doing me a favor, "you ought to mow the yard every 5 days, keep the place from looking wild." I blinked. "Oh, well, the front yard, sure. But the backfield's hay. We're letting it grow for a late spring cut." He stared at me for a moment, then smiled without his eyes. "Still best to keep things neat." There was a pause. His gaze flicked over me, not in a way that felt sexual, but like he was measuring something. "If there's anything you need," he added, "you ought to send your husband over, or call my wife. Best not to talk directly to me." I let out a confused laugh. "You mean if we need tools or something?" "Just in general." He nodded once, then said, "You'd look more motherly if you grew your hair out," and turned back toward the road. That night, Daniel shrugged it off. Small town quirks. Probably thinks he's being neighborly. I wanted to believe that. I really did. About a week later, I met his daughter Ruth. She was polite, soft-spoken, always tending to the rows of flowers in her yard. When she invited me over for tea, I thought maybe I'd misread her father. Maybe they were just blunt, old-fashioned people. Her house was cozy, filled with plants and the smell of cinnamon. We sat in the kitchen, chatting about weather and schools. She had that kind of smile people wear when they're used to smoothing over awkwardness, a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Halfway through, her phone rang. She excused herself, stepping into the hallway. Her house went quiet. Too quiet. After a minute, then two, I stood to stretch. That's when I noticed the door at the far end of the hall. Unlike the rest of the house, it was pristine, reinforced, out of place. 3 deadbolts stacked vertically. The paint around the frame was newer, but deep scratches marred the wood. Long, desperate gouges, like something had clawed from the inside out. I took a step toward it. "Just storage," Ruth's voice said suddenly behind me, too bright. She was smiling, but her eyes didn't match. "Old root cellar, not really safe down there." She steered me back to the kitchen, her hand light on my elbow. I didn't ask any more questions. That night, walking past her house toward our mailbox, I glanced at the basement windows, small, rectangular, just above the ground. One of them had a handprint. Not a smudge, but a full pressed hand. Small, child-sized, fresh. No streaks, no dirt, just the clean impression of someone leaning into the glass. When I told Daniel, he said it was probably from cleaning, or one of her grandkids. But it hadn't rained. There was no reason for it to be there. A few nights later, the boys woke up crying. In the morning, we found tire tracks cutting through our field, ending at the barn. No one admitted to being there. When Daniel checked the outdoor cameras, the footage from that night was gone. Not corrupted, erased. He replaced the SD card and set up backups. The final straw was that warm afternoon with the laundry. Walter at the edge of the property. "Don't dig there." I hadn't planned to, not until he said it. The next day, with Daniel in town and the boys napping, I took a shovel and walked to the spot he'd pointed out. The ground was soft, slightly sunken. 6 inches down, my shovel struck something solid. A rusted metal box. My heart hammered as I dragged it out and pried it open. Inside were photographs, dozens, curled and brittle with age, black and white, sepia, color. Everyone was of a family standing in front of our house. Couples, children, babies, spanning decades. In every photo, just off to the side, there he was, Walter, unchanged. My hands shook as I gathered them up. I needed answers. I crossed the road and knocked on his door. It wasn't Walter who answered. It was a small, quiet woman with gray hair pulled back tight. "Is Walter home?" I asked. Her expression shifted, softening into something like pity. "You must be mistaken," she said. "Walter passed nearly 3 years ago." I stepped back. "But I just spoke to him yesterday." She shook her head slowly. I'm sorry, that's not possible. I went home in a daze, spent the evening going through the photos again. One had a date scrawled on the back, 1979. Another, 1954. Different families, same house, same Walter. Online, I found old property records. The house had changed hands more than a dozen times in 60 years. Most owners stayed only a few years. Several had vanished without selling. One family, according to a newspaper clipping, was presumed missing. When I showed Daniel, he didn't sleep that night. Neither did I. We tried to move a week later. The U-Haul wouldn't start. The spare truck overheated. Our internet cut out. When I called for help, the sheriff came by. He stood on our porch, hat in his hands, and said, "Some places don't like being left behind." He smiled, just like Walter. That night, at 3:12 a.m., there was a knock at the door. Daniel checked. No one there. But on the porch, lying neatly against the welcome mat, was a fresh photograph of us, standing in front of the house, and just off to the side, Walter Grange, smiling. If you were me, would you stay? Or would you run even if the place didn't let you? I never thought we'd actually leave the city. Not for good. Moving was the sort of conversation Daniel and I used to have after the boys were asleep. Half serious, half fantasy. We'd talk about finding some quiet place where you could actually see the stars at night, where the kids could ride their bikes without dodging traffic. But it was always someday. Someday when work eased up. Someday when the boys were older. Someday when life allowed it. The shift happened so quietly that I almost missed it. The upstairs apartment flooded for the second time in 6 months. Black water dripped from the ceiling into mixing bowls we'd scrambled to set out. Our landlord gave the same excuse. We're working on it. But weeks later, the mold crept along the corners of the boys' bedroom anyway, a dark bloom that never stopped growing. Their coughs turned into something steady, the sound becoming a part of the apartment like the hum of the fridge. The woman downstairs fought with her boyfriend almost every night, shouts that started as muffled and then swelled into open-throated screaming. One night she threw something heavy at the wall and the plaster cracked above our baseboard. But what made the idea of leaving shift from fantasy to necessity came one afternoon in late September. We were eating takeout, lo mein, barely warm, while the twins napped in the blanket fort they'd built in the living room. Gunshots cracked the air, sharp, too close. Sirens followed. A 15-year-old boy was caught in the crossfire 3 blocks away. I looked at Daniel. What if we just left? This time he didn't smile, didn't joke about it. He just said, "Yeah, okay." 3 months later, we were holding a set of keys on the porch of a modest farmhouse in a place called Juniper Hollow, population 612. The house wasn't grand. White siding in need of paint, a wraparound porch with missing lattice, floorboards that answered every step. But it sat on 5 acres of grass and trees and open sky. At night, the silence felt thick enough to touch. You could hear the wind shifting through the tall grass, an occasional owl calling from the woods. The town looked like something out of a painting. One diner, a gas station, a feed store that sold homemade jam by the register. The post office was open 3 hours a day. People waved as they drove by, even if they didn't know you. Especially if they didn't know you. The first weeks felt like we'd stumbled into the life we'd been promised by real estate ads. The boys stayed out until dusk, returning with muddy shoes and wild hair. I drank coffee on the porch, dug my hands into the garden soil, and fell asleep to crickets instead of sirens. We painted rooms together. We found a rhythm that made the city feel like another lifetime. Then I met Harold. It was a cold March morning, frost still clinging to the grass. I was heading back from the mailbox when I noticed him across the road, kneeling over a flower bed, trimming the edges with a pair of old shears that clicked softly with each cut. He stood when he saw me, tall, lean, with thick silver hair combed neatly back. His face was younger than the hair suggested, much younger. "Morning," he called out. "Morning," I replied. "You must be the new folks who bought the Whitaker place." "That's us. I'm Emily." Harold. He crossed the gravel road, his stride long and deliberate. He shook my hand, firm, eyes steady and pale blue, holding my gaze a beat too long. Been here all my life. Most everyone in town is family one way or another. My daughter's just down that way. He gestured toward a bend in the road. My nephew's right next to you. He looked past me at the house, then back like he was measuring something. That evening I mentioned him to Daniel. Harold's in his 80s, he said. I blinked. No, he's not. 55, maybe 60? Daniel shrugged. Small town genes. He laughed, but I didn't. A few days later, I was by the barn pulling weeds when a shadow fell across me. You ought to mow every 5 days, Harold said, no greeting. Keeps the place from looking wild. I shaded my eyes. The front, sure. But the back's hay, we're letting it grow for a spring cut. He didn't answer right away, just stared. Then, still, best to keep things neat. A pause, long enough to notice. If there's anything you need, he said, send your husband over, or call my wife. Like tools? I asked. No answer. His gaze moved over me, not leering, just deciding something. You'd look more motherly if you grew your hair out. Heat climbed my face. Excuse me? He turned and walked away without another word. That was the first time I felt it. The prickle of unease, like the air in town shifted when he was near. Over the next weeks, I began noticing small things. The old woman at the post office paused when I gave our address, like she was sorting through something in her mind before handing over our mail. A man at the diner asked if we were settling in okay, but didn't wait for an answer. A boy, maybe 10, rode past on a bike and shouted, "Don't go near the woods after dark," before disappearing around the bend. Then came Maggie, Harold's daughter. She stopped by one afternoon with a pie and an invitation for tea. Her home was warm, low-ceilinged, cluttered in a lived-in way. The smell of cinnamon and something floral lingered in the air. We talked about gardens, weather, school options. She smiled often, but there was a stiffness to it, like she was following instructions. Halfway through, her phone rang. She excused herself down the hall. I stood to stretch and my eyes caught on a door at the far end. It didn't match the rest of the house, too new, paint brighter than the worn trim. 3 deadbolts ran down one side, and there were deep, ragged scratches along the lower half of the wood. I stepped closer. "Just storage," Maggie's voice said, sharp but cheerful. She was suddenly in the hall, hands clasped. Old root cellar, not really safe down there. She ushered me back to the kitchen before I could speak. That night, I walked past her house toward the mailbox. One basement window was visible above the dirt line. A small handprint marked the glass. Not smudged, perfectly clear, pressed flat, child-sized, fresh. When I told Daniel, he said it was probably one of her grandkids, but his voice was too careful. A week later, the boys woke crying. Daniel went to check on them and came back pale. Tire tracks cut through our backfield, deep ruts leading to the barn. The cameras we'd installed after moving in showed nothing. Not a glitch, not a corrupted file, just empty space, as if the footage had been erased. 2 nights after, I saw Harold at the edge of our property. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just stared. Then he pointed toward the tree line. "Don't dig there," he said. I hadn't planned to dig, until he told me not to. The next afternoon, with Daniel in town and the boys napping, I took a shovel to the spot. 6 inches down, the blade hit metal, a rusted box. Inside, photographs, dozens. Each showed a family in front of our house, spanning decades, different eras, different clothes, but always in the background, slightly out of focus. Harold. Same face, same posture. I took the box to his house. A small woman answered, hair gray, eyes tired. "Can I speak to Harold?" I asked. Her face tightened. "You must be mistaken. Harold passed almost 3 years ago." My mouth went dry. No. I saw him yesterday. I'm sorry, she said. That's not possible. That night I checked public records. The house had changed hands 14 times in 60 years. Most families didn't sell. They vanished. We decided to leave. The U-Haul's battery was dead. Our backup truck overheated before we reached the highway. The internet went down. Our phones lost signal. The sheriff came after I called. He stood in the drive, looked at the house, then at me. Some places don't like being left behind, he said. Then he smiled, and it was Harold's smile. That night, at 3:12 a.m., 3 slow knocks at the door. Daniel opened it. No one there, but on the porch, between the doormat and the boards, was a photograph. Us, standing in front of the house, and just off to the side, Harold. If you saw his face and knew he wasn't supposed to exist, would you run? Or would you stay and pretend you never saw him at all? I've always believed there's a difference between being desperate and being reckless, but in the summer before my sophomore year at college, that line blurred so badly I stopped caring which side I was on. When you're backed into a corner, out of money, out of options, you start ignoring the red flags, telling yourself they're not warnings at all, just little bits of fabric flapping harmlessly in the breeze. It was August in Maple Hollow, Illinois, the kind of heat that feels personal, sticking to your skin and pressing into you even in the shade. The cicadas were so loud in the evenings that you could feel the vibration in your ribs. My hometown was 40 minutes away, a smaller farm town that smelled like alfalfa and diesel. But I'd come to Maple Hollow for school, Harper State College, and I'd planned to stay here for the rest of my degree. I didn't plan on losing the student housing lottery. Harper State only let first years stay in the dorms unless you had a medical exemption or a special circumstance. I had neither, which meant in the span of 2 weeks I went from feeling stable to staring down the very real possibility of starting the semester without a place to live. Off-campus housing was a mess. Apartments were either falling apart or priced like they were made of gold. The few listings in my budget were sketchy, and none of them included utilities. I had about $200 saved from a year of working the concession stand at the Carmike Theater, enough for a deposit but nowhere near enough to cover rent on my own for more than a month or two. That's when I did what any broke, mildly optimistic 19-year-old would do. I made a roommate ad and prayed. I posted it to the Harper State Classifieds and Craigslist. Quiet, responsible student looking to split rent on a 2-bedroom within walking distance of campus. Non-smoker, clean, respectful. Serious about school. Message if interested. Nothing fancy, nothing needy, just the truth. I hit post at 9:23 p.m., then made myself a bowl of instant noodles, because that was about all I could afford most nights. At 10:01 p.m. I got a reply. Her name was Margaret Lorne. She wrote in short, neat sentences, said she was recently retired, looking for a smaller place after losing her husband the year before. She was 72. That made me pause. A 72-year-old roommate? I stared at the screen for a while, wondering if it was worth replying. Then I reread her message. She sounded nice. Said she liked students, liked quiet, wouldn't be a bother. She offered to pay half the rent without hesitation. At that moment, she was my only response. By the time September rolled around, we'd signed a lease for a little brick duplex on Caldwell Street, 5 blocks from campus. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, creaky wood floors, blinds yellowed from years of sunlight, but clean. The front porch sagged a little on the right side, but it had a swing. There was a tall maple in the front yard that threw shade over the living room windows. Margaret was small, maybe 5'1", thin but not frail. Her hair was pure white, pulled back in a bun so tight it made her cheekbones look sharper. She wore long skirts and cardigans even in the heat, and she moved with this slow precision, like every step was measured. She smelled faintly of lavender soap, the kind that came in paper wrapping. We moved in on the same day. She arrived with a single box and 1 battered suitcase. "I don't believe in clutter," she said. She chose the smaller bedroom in the back of the house and told me I could have the one with the bay window. Said she didn't watch TV and spent most of her time reading or working on puzzles. For the first couple of weeks, she was the ideal roommate. Polite, quiet, unobtrusive. I'd come home from class, make dinner, and maybe hear her moving around in her room or putting on the kettle. Sometimes she'd step into the kitchen while I was cooking and say something like, "Long day?" or "That smells lovely," and then drift away again. I told myself I'd lucked out. Then the giggling started. The first time it was a Tuesday night. I was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, laptop on the coffee table, hammering out a paper due the next morning. The sound was faint at first, high-pitched, almost girlish. I assumed she was on the phone with a friend. But there was no other voice, no conversation, just the laughter. Short bursts, sharp at the edges, like she was watching something that only she could see. It happened again 2 nights later. And again after that. Always late at night. Always with no words, just those sharp, floating giggles. The sound made my skin feel tight, like I was overhearing something private, something I wasn't meant to notice. Then came the staring. It was never in the daylight. Always in the dim hours between dinner and bed. I'd be sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone or reading, and I'd feel it. The prickling awareness that someone was looking at me. I'd glance up and there she'd be, standing just inside the hallway to her room, half hidden in shadow, hands clasped loosely in front of her stomach. Her face was slack except for the small, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hey, Margaret," I'd say. She'd just nod, slow and deliberate, before turning and walking away. I told myself she was lonely, maybe awkward around younger people. I told myself it wasn't worth making things weird by mentioning it. But by mid-October, it had shifted from odd to wrong. The first real jolt came at 3 in the morning on a Wednesday. I woke to the sound of tapping, soft, steady, too rhythmic to be random. I sat up, heart climbing into my throat. The sound was coming from my bedroom door. I waited, telling myself it had to be the pipes or a branch against the house. But it kept going. Tap, 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 light and deliberate like a child playing a game. Finally, I whispered, "Margaret?" The tapping stopped. Then came the giggle, clear as glass, just inches from the other side of the door. I went rigid. My mouth felt too dry to swallow. I stayed frozen until daylight. The next morning, I tried to ask her about it. I waited until I heard her making tea, then stepped into the kitchen. "Were you up late last night?" I asked. She looked up, her expression neutral. "Oh no, dear. I was asleep by 9. I thought I heard tapping on my door." Her lips curved into that same slow smile. Dreams can be so loud, can't they? That night, I pushed my desk in front of my bedroom door. It was heavy enough that it would make noise if someone tried to move it. At 3:12 a.m., the handle rattled. Not a gentle try, a steady, deliberate twisting, like someone testing how far they could turn it before the latch gave. I held my breath. The desk shuddered slightly as the door pushed against it. Then it stopped. I was about to relax when I saw it. The thin sliver of space between the door and frame. An eye pressed into it. Her eye. Just watching. She didn't blink. Then she screamed. The sound was raw and sudden, like it had been ripped out of her. She screamed my name, screamed words I couldn't piece together except for one. "Shouldn't be here." The door slammed hard, over and over, the desk jolting forward each time. I threw myself against it, yelling at her to stop, then silence. When I finally called the police, my voice shook so badly the dispatcher had to ask me to repeat myself. I told them a woman was trying to break down my bedroom door. They came in under 10 minutes. When I opened my door for them, my knees almost gave out. Every single knife from our kitchen had been stabbed into the wood. Some were sunk so deep the blades were buried. Others just dangled from the surface. The door looked like it had grown metal spines overnight. Margaret didn't come out of her room at first. One of the officers knocked gently. The other stayed with me in the hallway. When they finally got her out, she fought them, screaming about demons, voices, and blood in the walls. She never looked at me. By November, I'd moved across town into a cramped apartment with 2 other students. The rent was tight, but I didn't care. I could sleep without pushing furniture against my door. 2 weeks later, an officer followed up. He told me there were no records of a Margaret Lorne in Illinois. No medical history, no next of kin, nothing. The name on her ID didn't exist in any state registry. The landlord said she'd answered his Craigslist ad and paid cash. I don't know who she really was. I don't know why she wanted to live with me or what she was doing in the middle of the night outside my door. But I'll never forget the way her eye looked through that crack, like she wasn't just watching me, like she was waiting. And sometimes when I wake up at night and the house is too quiet, I can almost hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. If it happened to you, would you open the door? When I was 11, the world felt too big in some ways and too close in others. Our neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place realtors called peaceful, and my mom called safe. But there were nights when I'd stand in my bedroom and feel the dark pressing in from every direction. Not peaceful exactly, more like something was holding its breath, waiting. We lived in the very last house at the end of Willow Creek Lane, a cul-de-sac bordered on one side by a patch of undeveloped land, and on the other by a thin belt of trees that led to an old overgrown drainage ditch. Our street had maybe a dozen houses, all with tidy lawns and driveways that shone with fresh blacktop. The kind of place where you'd expect block parties and kids riding bikes in the summer. But our end of the street was different, quieter. The streetlights didn't quite reach us, and at night the shadows were deeper. It was just me, my mom, and my dad in that 2-story house with beige siding and green shutters. Dad had been transferred to a different branch of the bank he worked for, so we'd moved from a busy part of town to this safe little pocket on the edge of the suburbs. Mom worked part-time from home doing bookkeeping for a couple of local shops, and she loved that I could walk to and from Willow Creek Middle School without crossing any major roads. The only problem was, to get home, I had to pass the Carter place. If you were looking at it in the middle of the day, you might think it was just another aging house in need of a little TLC. It sat on a corner lot with a chain-link fence that leaned in spots and grass that never seemed to get cut on time. The shutters were faded and peeling, and all the front windows had been painted over from the inside with thick coats of white. Not blinds, not curtains, just paint, like someone wanted to erase the outside world completely. And then there was him. I never knew his first name. My parents just called him Mr. Carter, but there was no warmth in the way they said it. He was old, much older than my grandparents, thin as a scarecrow with skin that sagged and pulled tight in strange places. He moved slowly most of the time, but there was something coiled underneath it, like a spring waiting to snap. His eyes didn't just look at you. They lingered, dragging over you in a way that made your stomach feel hollow. Every afternoon, I'd cross the last stretch of Maple Ridge Drive, cut down Willow Creek Lane, and pass his house. If he was outside, I'd feel it before I saw him, the weight of his gaze. Sometimes he'd be sitting on the edge of his porch, elbows on his knees, watching the street. Sometimes he'd be standing in the yard, motionless, like he'd been standing there all day. "Hey, Hannah," he said once. My name sounded wrong in his mouth, stretched out, drawn thin. I was halfway down the sidewalk and pretended not to hear. The gravel in his driveway crunched. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" I gripped my backpack straps tighter and kept my head down. If I looked up, if I made eye contact, it would feel like giving something away. My heart thudded hard in my ears, and I only breathed easier once I was past our mailbox and inside the front door. I didn't tell my parents that first time, or the second, or the 10th. I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe he was just lonely and weird. But in bed at night, I'd replay those moments and wonder why his voice didn't sound like any neighborly greeting I'd ever heard. Weeks went by. Winter melted into spring, and I started noticing little things. Things I tried to ignore. Once, on my way home, I saw him standing inside his fenced yard with a rake in his hand, staring at the middle school as if he were waiting for someone. Another time, I caught him halfway down the sidewalk toward my end of the street, but when I looked again, he'd turned away and shuffled back to his porch. One Friday afternoon, the wind was sharp and the air smelled like rain. I rounded the corner and saw him standing by the gate of his fence, holding it open just enough for me to see the rusted latch. "You're getting tall," he said. I muttered, "Yeah," before I could stop myself and instantly regretted it. His eyes lit up, just a little. "You should stop and talk sometime. Don't be rude." I didn't answer. I just walked faster, my sneakers slapping against the sidewalk. That night at dinner, Mom was telling Dad about some client who'd dropped off paperwork late, and I just pushed my peas around my plate. "You're quiet," Mom said. "Everything okay at school?" I shrugged. "Yeah, just tired." Dad put down his fork. "Hannah, if someone's bothering you, you can tell us. Anybody." My throat tightened. "It's nothing." They let it drop, but the knot in my stomach stayed. It wasn't just the afternoons anymore. Sometimes, lying in bed, I'd think I saw a flicker of light from the patch of woods between our houses. Just a quick beam, bobbing and swaying, like someone carrying a flashlight. Like someone who knew exactly where my bedroom was. The first time it happened, I told myself it was a neighbor walking a dog. The second time, I told myself it was a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. It was late June when things changed. The air was thick and still, and I'd left my window cracked to try and catch a breeze. I was drifting toward sleep when a sound pulled me back. A low, dull thud against the side of the house. I froze. Another thud. My brain scrambled for explanations, a branch in the wind, a raccoon, but then I heard the faint scrape of wood on siding. The ladder. I'd seen it before, propped against his porch. Old gray wood with splinters running the length of the rungs. My body went cold. Then came the knock. Soft at first, then steady. A tapping against the glass right beside my head. I turned, and he was there. His face filled the corner of the window, inches from mine, separated only by the thin pane of glass. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his mouth was twisted into a smile that never touched them. His fingers tapped in a slow rhythm like an invitation. I couldn't move. My skin prickled, and my ears roared with my heartbeat. Then, all at once, my legs worked, and I bolted. My bare feet pounded down the hallway, and I slammed my hands against my parents' door. "Dad, Mom, he's at my window." Everything after that blurred. Dad grabbed the flashlight from his dresser. Mom's robe flared behind her as we ran back to my room. The beam swept across the yard. No ladder, no man, just grass and shadows and the quiet hum of summer insects. Dad looked at me. "Hannah, are you sure you weren't dreaming?" "No." My voice was small but certain. It was him. He was looking at me. Mom rubbed my back, murmuring something about how our minds can play tricks when we're half asleep, but her eyes kept scanning the yard. For days, I couldn't shake it. I checked my window locks 3 times a night. I avoided walking past his house even if it meant taking the long way home. And then, without warning, he was gone. The house sat empty, the grass climbing higher, the paint on the porch peeling further. A for sale sign appeared one morning, tilting slightly in the dirt. I never saw him move out. No truck, no goodbye. One day he was there, and the next he wasn't. A young family bought the place. They scrubbed the paint from the windows, planted flowers along the fence, filled the yard with the sound of kids laughing. The house looked different, lighter. But when I walked past, my eyes still darted to the second-story windows. I never told anyone the whole truth. Not about the flashlight in the woods. Not about how many times the tapping came back before that night. Not about how close I came to opening the window. just to make it stop. Years later, I finally told my mom more than I ever had. We were sitting on the back porch in early fall, the air crisp, the sun dropping behind the trees. "Do you remember Mr. Carter?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Yeah, I remember." "I should have told you everything," I said. "I thought you wouldn't believe me." She shook her head, her voice low. "Hannah, sometimes grown-ups, we don't want to believe something bad could happen so close to home. But I believe you, and I'm sorry." Her words didn't erase what happened, but they eased something in me. Even now, I still think about him. About the way danger doesn't always come crashing in with noise and chaos. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it moves slowly, patiently, until it's right outside your window. And sometimes it knocks. What would you do if the person you feared most was standing on the other side of the glass smiling, and no one else was there to see it? When I first arrived in Portland, I thought I was starting a softer, slower chapter of my life. My name is Claire Bennett, 30 years old, and for most of my 20s I drifted between cities, chasing freelance illustration work that barely kept my lights on. New York had chewed me up. Los Angeles had drained me. Even Seattle felt too fast, too full of teeth. I wanted something that could hold me without swallowing me whole. Portland seemed to promise that. Manageable, quirky, green in every sense. I found the apartment through a friend of a friend who'd moved out in a hurry. It was in a 4-story brick building that had seen better decades, tucked on a quiet street just far enough from downtown to skip the constant sirens. The rent was low enough that I double-checked twice, expecting some hidden catch. The catch, if there was one, wasn't visible at first. The building had a small bakery on the ground floor, run by a husband and wife who seemed permanently dusted in flour. My first morning there, the scent of cinnamon rolls drifted through the hallway like a welcome banner. I remember standing in my half-unpacked kitchen, coffee in hand, thinking, maybe this could work. That same day I met Daniel. He lived on the 3rd floor, just 5 doors down from mine. Tall and lean, with a voice that was steady in the way radio announcers are steady. The kind of voice that makes you lean in without realizing. He spotted me struggling with a box of books in the stairwell and offered to help. "Most people don't stay in this building long," he said as he took the box from me with an ease that made me feel a little self-conscious. I asked why, but he just smiled like it was a joke I wasn't in on. I laughed politely, thinking maybe he meant the rent would spike or that the landlord was difficult. In the weeks that followed, Daniel became a near-constant presence. He'd knock on my door some mornings with coffee, always black, always in the same kind of paper cup from a cafe I'd never heard of. Sometimes he'd slide little sketches under my door with notes that said things like, "This reminded me of you," or "Saw this in my head last night." They were delicate drawings, done in charcoal or pen, full of small, intricate lines. I was flattered at first. It felt old-fashioned in a world where everyone's thoughtfulness is just an emoji and a text. We'd end up in long hallway conversations, talking about movies, music, the kind of weird internet rabbit holes we'd fallen into. He listened closely, really listened, the way people rarely do. But there was something else under it. Sometimes, late at night when I was working at my drawing table, I'd glance out my living room window and see him on his balcony, leaning on the railing, smoking in complete stillness. Not scrolling his phone, not talking to anyone, just watching the street. Sometimes his eyes seemed to flicker upward, toward my windows, but it was hard to tell in the dim light. I started to notice smaller things. When I mentioned I'd been feeling restless, he said, "That's because you're not meant to be out there. The world is too loud for people like us." People like us. The phrase felt like an invitation and a warning all at once. One night, as I was sketching a cover concept for a small press, I heard humming in the hallway. Not the usual neighbor noises, no doors shutting or footsteps, just a low, steady hum. It was right outside my door. My stomach tightened. I got up quietly, peered through the peephole, and there was Daniel, standing still, staring at my door, not knocking, not moving, just humming like he was lost in some private song. The second I stepped back, the humming stopped. I told myself maybe he was just thinking, maybe he didn't realize how strange it looked. But a few days later, I went out for dinner with a coworker, a guy I barely knew from a local gallery, and the next morning there was a note slipped under my door. I don't like him. No signature, no explanation, but I knew the handwriting. I hadn't told anyone about the dinner, not my landlord, not another neighbor, not even Daniel. That's when the charm started to feel like something else. It wasn't that I was afraid of him in the obvious sense, not yet. It was subtler. He had this way of making it feel like he knew me better than I knew myself, like every move I made was part of a story he'd already written. And part of me, the part that had been lonely, rootless, wanted to believe him, wanted someone to see me that completely. "We're the only two real people here, Claire," he said one evening as we stood by the mailboxes. "Everyone else is just filling space." I laughed, because what else do you do? But in my chest, something felt tight. The first real jolt came on a rainy Thursday when my internet went out mid-project. I knocked on his door to ask if he knew the provider's number. He didn't hesitate and just stepped aside and said, "You can use my Wi-Fi until yours is fixed." His apartment was dim, the kind of dim that feels intentional. Only one lamp glowed in the corner, throwing long shadows across the walls. And on those walls, neat rows of pinned charcoal portraits. All of them were of me. Some looked recent, drawn in the past few weeks. Others looked older, like they were based on photos or memories from before I'd even moved in. One showed me on the street wearing a winter coat I'd gotten rid of 2 years ago. Another was unmistakably me, asleep in my bed, hair spread across the pillow. I froze. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was some kind of project, maybe he'd gotten photos from social media. But there was no way he could have drawn the sleeping one unless he'd been there. "You're beautiful when you dream," he said softly, like it was a compliment I should be grateful for. I mumbled something, I don't even remember what, and left so fast I nearly tripped in the hallway. That night, I pushed my desk against the door. I didn't sleep. The next morning, taped to my door, was a single daisy and a note. "You don't need to be afraid. You belong here. With me." From then on, the cinnamon smell from the bakery made me feel sick. Every time I went down the hall, I felt the weight of his gaze, even if the door was shut, even if I couldn't see him. When I mentioned to him in passing that I might move to a bigger place, his smile faltered just for a moment. His voice went flat. "You won't. You're not going anywhere." One night, just past midnight, I heard the faint sound of breathing outside my door. When I looked through the peephole, he was there again, standing perfectly still, hands clasped loosely in front of him. I whispered through the crack, "Please leave me alone." He tilted his head slowly like he was listening to a faraway sound. He didn't leave. I moved out 3 days later. I didn't tell him. I hired movers, packed in the middle of the day while he was at work, and left before sunset. I changed my phone number, my routines, everything I could think of. My new apartment is across the river, smaller but brighter. I tell myself I'm safe, and yet, last week I came home to find a slip of paper on the floor just inside my door. No envelope, no signature, just a sketch of me at my new window, coffee in hand. Sometimes kindness isn't kindness. Sometimes it's a cage. And the bars don't always look like bars until you're already inside. If someone seems to know you too well, to predict your movements, to decide who belongs in your life and who doesn't, how do you know if it's fate or the start of being trapped? When I first moved into that old brick apartment building on the west side of Dayton, I wasn't looking for charm or style. I was looking for something that wouldn't drain the last few $100s I had saved. I was 24, coming off the tail end of a breakup that left me with more debt than dignity, and my job at Hanley's Hardware barely covered gas and groceries. The apartment was a one-bedroom walk-up with a cracked kitchen window that rattled in the wind, and an unshakable smell of damp plaster. It cost $645 a month, and the landlord didn't ask too many questions. That was good enough for me. The building sat wedged between an abandoned auto shop and a chain-link fence that bordered the railroad tracks. Every night the low rumble of freight cars would roll through, shaking the walls like a pulse. It wasn't quiet, but I figured the noise would be a kind of company. I've never been great with silence. The first week I barely saw anyone. There was an older guy downstairs who chain-smoked on the stoop and nodded when I passed, and a woman on the third floor who seemed to move with a constant hurry, never looking up from her phone. But it was the man who lived directly across from me that I noticed most, though not because I wanted to. His name was Mitch Carter. He was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, stocky with a shaved head that caught the yellow hallway light in a dull gleam. I didn't meet him right away. The first thing I knew about Mitch came through the wall between our apartments. Heavy bass music at strange hours, doors slamming hard enough to make the picture frames on my wall tilt, and sometimes a low, angry voice I couldn't make out. One rainy evening in March, I ran into a woman on the stairwell as I was coming home from my shift. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with tired eyes and long hair tucked under a hooded sweatshirt. The air smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and something metallic. She moved to the side to let me pass, but I hesitated. "You okay?" I asked, more out of instinct than anything else. She glanced past me toward the door at the end of the hall, then shook her head quickly. "I'm fine," she said, her voice low. "Just, if he talks to you, don't argue. Just agree. It's easier that way." I didn't know who she meant then, but her tone had a weight to it, the kind of weight you only get from living with someone's temper. I wanted to ask more, but she was already brushing past me, her footsteps quick on the stairs. After that, I started paying more attention to the sounds that seeped through the walls. Sometimes there was laughter, loud, sudden, almost too sharp to sound happy. Other times, a steady thud like furniture being moved. One night, close to midnight, I heard a long string of muffled shouting followed by a crash. I sat frozen on my couch, phone in hand, not dialing, not moving, just waiting. Then silence. Silence that somehow felt heavier than the noise. When I finally saw Mitch face to face, it was in the parking lot a few weeks later. I'd gotten home late, the sky a deep, still blue with a thin edge of frost in the air. He was standing between two cars, smoking. His eyes followed me as I climbed the stairs. I gave a short nod. "Evening," I said. He didn't answer, didn't smile, just kept watching me until I reached my door. I could feel the weight of his gaze even after I closed it. From then on, it seemed like Mitch was always around. He'd be in the laundry room when I went down to switch loads, leaning against the machines with his arms crossed. He'd show up by the mailboxes when I checked for bills, his eyes lingering a little too long. Once, leaning casually against the railing outside my apartment, he asked, "You live alone, right?" "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone even. "Good. No one to slow you down." I laughed lightly, but it felt forced. He didn't laugh back. The unease became a constant hum in the background of my days. I'd catch myself checking the peephole before leaving, listening for his voice in the hallway. Late one night, around 3 a.m, I woke to the sound of him laughing, loud, almost manic, and pacing outside my door. His footsteps went back and forth, the laugh cutting off into muttered words I couldn't make out. On a Thursday night in early April, the noise next door turned sharp again, yelling, then a heavy slam, then something breaking. My stomach clenched. I stood in the middle of my living room staring at my phone, torn between calling the cops and doing nothing. The shouting stopped suddenly. The silence pressed in. The next morning, as I left for work, I saw the woman from the stairwell loading a black trash bag into the trunk of her car. She moved quickly, glancing up at me just once before slamming the trunk shut. Her expression was tight, almost panicked. She drove off before I could say anything. 2 nights later, I got home to find Mitch crouched by the dumpster at the far end of the lot. The yellow security light cast long shadows across the asphalt. When he saw me, he stood up slowly. "You work late, huh?" he said. "Yeah. Late nights are dangerous around here." There was nothing in his tone to suggest a joke, just a flat statement, like he knew something I didn't. 3 mornings later, pounding on his door woke me. I peeked through the blinds to see 2 police officers outside, their voices sharp as they called for him to open up. When there was no answer, they broke the door in. For the next hour, the hallway buzzed with voices and the sound of boots on the stairs. The rumors started before the day was over. By evening, the news had the details. Mitch had killed his girlfriend sometime after midnight and dumped her remains by the railroad tracks. The timeline matched too closely. The night I'd seen him by the dumpster, the trash bag in her trunk, the laughter in the hallway. In the days after his arrest, I kept thinking about the wall between us. Thin, hollow, not enough to stop a voice or a fist, not enough to keep danger out. I replayed every strange moment, every warning sign I'd brushed off as paranoia. I wondered how many other people had heard what I heard and done nothing. The building felt emptier without him, but it wasn't peace I felt. It was the echo of something that had been too close for too long. The knowledge that you can live steps away from a nightmare and never realize it until it's too late. And I keep thinking about that woman in the stairwell, about her warning. I wonder if I could have done something more than just listen. I wonder if you can ever really know the people on the other side of the wall, or if you only find out when the noise stops. If you heard something that felt wrong, really wrong, would you say something? Or would you keep your head down and hope it wasn't your problem? There are places that get under your skin the moment you step inside, though you can't always explain why. Sometimes it's in the air, the way it smells faintly of something old you can't name. Sometimes it's in the stillness, like the walls have been listening longer than you've been alive. When I first saw the brick apartment building on Oakview Street in Columbus, Ohio, I felt that pull. It wasn't beautiful in any obvious way, just 3 stories of weathered red brick, built sometime in the late 1940s. With narrow hallways that smelled faintly of varnish and boiled coffee, and a small shared basement with wire mesh storage cages for tenants. The windows were the tall, drafty kind you had to muscle open, and the front door had a brass knob rubbed dull from decades of turning. I was 32 that spring, working as a copy editor for a small academic press near the university. Rent had been eating me alive at my last place, a newer complex that was clean but sterile. So when I found this 1-bedroom that was a 10-minute walk to work and close to 2 decent coffee shops, I signed the lease without hesitation. The rent was just low enough that I could justify splurging on decent groceries again, and the trees that lined the street were old sugar maples that, I imagined, would turn fire red come autumn. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, facing the street. The living room had original hardwood floors that sloped ever so slightly toward the windows, and a narrow hallway that led to a kitchen barely wide enough for 1 person. It had quirks, but after years of transitory, bland rentals, I craved something with character. The day I moved in, it was drizzling, the air smelling like wet pavement and spring mud. I had just wedged myself halfway through the doorway with a box full of kitchenware when a man appeared at the top of the stairwell. He was tall, maybe late 50s, with broad shoulders and weathered hands, wearing a faded gray flannel shirt. His thinning blonde hair was combed back, and a cigarette was tucked behind one ear like it belonged there. "Need a hand with that?" he asked. Before I could answer, he strode over and lifted the box from my arms as if it weighed nothing. "Thanks," I said, catching my breath. He carried it into my living room, set it down with a careful thud, and gave me a small, polite smile. "Don't mind the noises at night. This place talks to itself. Been around longer than both of us put together." His name, he told me, was Howard King. He lived directly above me. Our conversation was brief. After a nod and a welcome to the building, he disappeared up the stairs. Still, I appreciated the gesture. In a building with only 6 apartments, a little goodwill between neighbors seemed worth cultivating. The first month passed quietly enough. I'd hear Howard's footsteps in the evenings, the soft creak of his floorboards as he moved from room to room, the muted sound of a television, sometimes a low murmur of his voice on the phone. He seemed to keep to himself, and I was fine with that. Then the small things began. Subtle, easy to dismiss if you wanted to. One morning, I noticed my silver ring, the one my mother gave me when I graduated college, was missing from the little ceramic bowl on my dresser. I looked everywhere, under the bed, between couch cushions, in every drawer. A week later, I found it in my kitchen junk drawer under a stack of takeout menus. I told myself I must have moved it absent-mindedly, maybe while cleaning. But as I closed the drawer, there was a flicker of unease. It happened again a few days later. The throw blanket I always left draped over my couch was folded into a perfect square when I came home from work. Another time, a coffee mug I'd left upside down on the drying rack was sitting on the counter, its handle turned toward the doorway. Little things, easy to brush off. But with each one, the sense of being alone in my apartment began to shift, like the air was holding its breath. It was mid-November when I finally went down to the basement. The temperature had dropped fast, and I needed my heavier coat. The basement was reached by a narrow door off the first-floor hallway, its hinges groaning as I pushed it open. The single overhead bulb flickered enough to make the shadows seem alive. The smell hit me first. Cold concrete, damp cardboard, and something faintly sour like wet wood that never dried. Each tenant had a wire mesh storage cage padlocked and numbered. Mine was the third on the left. When I got there, I stopped short. The metal around the padlock was scratched, fresh, silvery marks etched into the dull steel. My padlock hung in place, but when I unlocked it and stepped inside, one of my boxes was open. My coat was on the floor as if it had been pulled out and dropped. I stood there for a long moment, my ears straining for any sound over the faint hum of the old boiler. Nothing. I told myself someone must have confused my unit for theirs, though the numbers were stenciled in black paint on each door. It didn't add up, but the alternative, that someone had been going through my things, sat in my chest like a stone. The next day I mentioned it to the woman in 1B, a warm, no-nonsense type named Patricia, who worked nights at the hospital. "You ever notice anyone messing around down there?" I asked. She frowned. "Howard's always down there. Says he's fixing stuff, but half the time he's not even carrying tools. Just standing around. You can hear everything from that basement. People walking, talking, even moving furniture." Her words lodged deep. That night, as I lay in bed, I listened to the steady rhythm of Howard's pacing overhead and wondered if he was listening for me. A week later, just after midnight, I woke to a metallic sound. Faint, deliberate. The turn of a key in a lock. I lay frozen, my heartbeat in my ears. Sliding out of bed, I crept to the door and pressed my eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty. The sound stopped. In the morning, I went to see Mr. Harris, the landlord. His office smelled faintly of mildew and paper. "Howard used to have a spare set of keys," he said after a pause. "Helped me with repairs before I could afford a handyman. I thought I'd gotten them all back. He promised to change my locks, but the way he said it told me he didn't feel any urgency." 2 nights later, I learned exactly how wrong he was. I was working late on my laptop when I heard movement upstairs. It struck me because Howard had mentioned that morning he was driving out to visit a friend overnight. I muted my music. Heavy steps crossed his apartment. Then, from below, came the faint clang of the basement door. My stomach tightened. After 10 seconds of hesitation, I grabbed my phone and headed downstairs. The air in the basement was colder than usual. The single bulb cast a pale halo, leaving the far corners in shadow. Through the wire mesh, I saw Howard inside my storage cage. My padlock dangled open. He was bent over a box, holding one of my old photo albums close to his face. His lips moved faintly, as if he were whispering to himself. A floorboard creaked under my weight. His head snapped up. Our eyes locked through the mesh. "You shouldn't be down here this late," he said softly. I turned and bolted, my shoes slapping against the concrete, the air seeming to thicken behind me. Back in my apartment, I locked the door and called the police. They came quickly, but Howard's apartment was dark when they knocked. In the basement, the officer noted there was no forced entry into my cage. Having an old landlord's key didn't count. The next evening, an envelope slid under my door. Inside was my silver ring, and a Polaroid of me asleep in my bed, my head turned toward the window. On the back, in block letters, "You looked peaceful." I left the next morning. I didn't take my couch, my dishes, or my plants. Anything I couldn't carry in 2 trips stayed behind. Even now, I can't stand the smell of damp concrete. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I swear I can hear the slow scrape of a key turning in a lock. How do you ever truly know that where you sleep is yours alone? Sometimes when people talk about starting over, they make it sound like a clean break. You fold up the old chapter, slip it in a drawer, and begin again with fresh ink. I've learned it doesn't work like that. You bring your history with you, tucked into your pockets, clinging to the folds of your clothes. It shows up in the way you hesitate before unlocking a door, the way you study people's faces a beat too long, wondering if you've misread them. I left Phoenix in July 2012. Trading dry desert heat for Denver's high-altitude air. Phoenix had stopped feeling like a home long before I packed my first box. The city felt baked and brittle, like it might crack if I stayed too long. My last year there had been a string of sharp edges, a breakup that played out like a bad drama in front of mutual friends, a job in a marketing firm that dulled my mind day after day, and a loneliness that spread into every part of my life. The final push came one late afternoon when I sat in my apartment with the blinds drawn, heat pressing in from all sides, and realized I'd gone 3 days without speaking to anyone. The air in the room felt stale, like I'd been breathing the same breath over and over. I told myself I needed altitude, a place where the air moved differently, where I could look out a window and see more than just sunburnt streets. The apartment I found in Denver was a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of an old red brick building east of downtown. Once a warehouse, it had been carved into loft-style units with high ceilings, exposed beams, and wide plank floors that creaked under my feet. The hallways smelled faintly of old coffee and wood polish, and every footstep echoed up the stairwell like the building itself was listening. It wasn't perfect. The windows rattled when the wind came down from the mountains, and the pipes clanged when the heat kicked in. But it had a view, 2 narrow west-facing windows that caught the sunset and the Rockies in the distance. The first night, I sat on the floor with takeout noodles, watching the mountains turn from gold to violet, and I told myself I'd made the right choice. The second night, I met Mark Reeves. I was crouched on the floor stacking books when I heard a voice through my half-open window. "You just move in?" I looked out across the narrow alley. On the balcony opposite mine stood a man in a worn gray t-shirt, forearms resting on the railing. He looked to be in his late 30s, tall and lean, with short dark hair and a day's worth of stubble. His smile wasn't wide, but it was steady, the kind people use when they want you to feel at ease. "2 days ago," I said, standing so he could see me better. "I'm Mark," he said. "Work security on night shifts. Means I'm up when most folks are asleep. So if you ever need someone to grab a package or keep an eye on your place, just shout." I smiled back. "I appreciate that. I'm Rachel." He nodded toward the street. "Coffee shop 2 blocks over does a decent pour-over. Rooftop decks open most evenings. Nice spot for sunsets. You'll see me around." The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it left me with the sense of a friendly neighbor in a city where I didn't know anyone yet. Over the next few weeks, our encounters stayed light. A wave from his balcony when I came home from the store, "How's it going?" in the stairwell. Once, when I'd gone away for the weekend, I came back to find my fern on the balcony watered. Thoughtful, I told myself. It wasn't until late August that I felt the first thin edge of unease. That evening, I carried my camera up to the rooftop deck to catch the last of the day's light. Denver sunsets had a way of stretching color across the whole sky. Burnt orange fading to rose with a metallic glint at the horizon. I was framing a shot when I heard footsteps behind me. "Figured I'd find you up here," Mark said. "Saw your blinds move earlier. I lowered my camera." "You can see my blinds from your place?" He smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Depends on the light." We stood together watching the sun drop behind the mountains. I told myself not to overthink it. People notice things. It didn't mean anything. A week later, I came home to find my doormat turned sideways. I laughed to myself and straightened it. The wind, probably. 2 days later, my balcony chair was in a different spot. I told myself I might have moved it. Then there was the camera bag. I kept it zipped on a shelf in my living room. One night I found it unzipped on the couch. I tried to remember if I'd been sorting photos that morning. The memory wouldn't settle. The night it rained, I stopped explaining things away. It was just before midnight. The air through the open window smelled of wet asphalt. I was editing a set of photos when I heard a faint tapping on the balcony glass. Soft, deliberate. My pulse thudded in my ears. I stood, pulled the curtain back a sliver. Mark was there, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, water dripping from his shirt. He held one of my photo prints in his hand. "You dropped this," he said through the glass. The print had been in my apartment earlier that day. I didn't open the door. I didn't say a word. I went to my bedroom, locked the door, and called my sister. My voice came out low, almost whispering, like I was afraid the walls might pass it along. She told me to call the police. By the time they arrived, Mark's balcony was dark. No signs of forced entry, they said. They'd have a word with him. For the next 2 weeks, he didn't speak to me, but I'd see him in the alley late at night, leaning on his railing, or in the hallway just far enough away to make it seem like coincidence. I kept my blinds shut, moved my camera bag into my bedroom, and locked the door whenever I left. Told a few friends, but without proof, it was just weird neighbor vibes. Then the envelope came, slipped under my door. Inside, a photograph of me, asleep, hair spilling across the pillow, dawn light filtering in. The angle was from my balcony glass. No note. The next morning, another envelope. This time a short message in blocky handwriting. "You look peaceful when you're not worrying." Something inside me went cold. I called my friend Claire. "Can I stay with you for a few days?" I didn't tell Mark. I didn't tell the landlord. I packed 2 bags, left my furniture, dishes, plants, everything. I locked the door, walked down the echoing stairwell, and didn't look back. I never returned. Claire helped me find a sublet in a neighborhood where the buildings faced the street, not each other. Months later, I still closed my blinds without thinking, even in daylight. I avoided eye contact with neighbors for fear of what they might read into it. Safety isn't just locks and keys. It's the moment you stop doubting your own unease. People who cross small boundaries rarely stop there. If you felt the lines of your safety shifting under someone else's presence, how soon would you trust yourself enough to walk away?